I've been dead for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The Imperium simply hasn't told my body yet. The iron door slammed shut behind me with a sound like breaking bones, final and absolute. In that instant, I knew I would never again see the pale, dying light of Tertius Prime's sun. The guards didn't speak my crimes aloud. They didn't need to. Here, words like guilt or innocence mean nothing. Heresy, sedition, failure to meet tithe obligations, disrespect toward a planetary governor's nephew who wore the uniform of the Astra Militarum like a masquerade costume. The list blurred together long ago. These accusations belong to the world above, a world that still pretends justice exists. Down here, beneath the surface, in the bowels of Penitentia Maxima, there is only endurance. The intake chamber reeked of disinfectant and fear. The air burned in the nose and clawed at the throat, thick with the scent of sweat and despair, the smell of hundreds who had passed through before me. Around me, lines of the condemned stretched beyond the reach of the flickering lumens. Shackles clinked in a slow, haunting rhythm that almost sounded like a prayer whispered by the damned. Beside me stood a thin merchant, arrested for selling counterfeit devotional candles. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Tears slid down his cheeks, falling to the cracked concrete floor, vanishing instantly into the thirsty stone. The ground here had drunk the moisture of 10,000 broken souls before him. When my turn came, a servitor rolled forward. Once it might have been human. Now it was a patchwork of metal and decayed flesh, a mockery of life. One I had been replaced by a crude optical scanner that clicked and whirred as it studied me. The other remained organic and somehow heartbreakingly human. That single, bloodshot, I seemed to hold something like pity, if pity were still permitted after the lobotomization process. Cold metal fingers pressed against my throat. The servitor took my pulse, my temperature, my chemical readings, data to identify my corpse when the time arrived. Inmate 779588. It rasped in a voice of grinding gears. Classification, political. Subclassification, sedition, minor. Estimated survival duration, 8 to 12 months. 8 to 12 months. They had measured out my death before I had even seen my cell. The uniform they gave me was brown, the color of dried blood and rusted iron. It hung loose on my frame, rough and coarse, made for function, not comfort. Its purpose was simple, easy identification should I try to escape. The fabric carried a faint scent of its previous owner. I try not to imagine whether they had died in it, or merely stopped needing clothing at all. My cell awaited me, a cube of reinforced rockcrete, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep, and just tall enough for me to stand without touching the ceiling if I kept my shoulders hunched. The walls forever wept with condensation, forming dark stains that looked like maps of worlds I would never see again. Near the floor, a narrow slot allowed the guards to slide in a tray of gray nutrient paste. Another slit, placed at eye level, let them watch me whenever they pleased. There was no window, no sun, no sense of time, only the glare of a single lumen strip, harsh, eternal, merciless. My sleeping platform was nothing more than a shelf of cold metal welded to the wall. No mattress, no pillow, no blanket. Only the thin fabric of my prison uniform to separate me from the chill. Within minutes, the cold found my bones, coiling around them like a parasite feeding on warmth and hope alike. I learned quickly that sleep here was not rest, merely an escape from consciousness, a brief surrender to darkness that left me more exhausted than before. That first night, I listened to the sounds of Penitentia Maxima breathing around me. The grinding machinery, the distant screams, the whisper of chains, and realized the truth. The Imperium had not buried me in a tomb. It had buried me alive. The walls spoke in whispers. They carried voices from distant cells, fragments of prayer, curses, and mad laughter, drifting through the vents like echoes from the underworld. Somewhere far below, someone screamed. The sound was raw, endless, and soon became just another note in the symphony of despair, no more remarkable than the hum of the power generators or the scratching of rats inside the stone. I learned to count the seconds between patrols, memorizing the rhythm like a litany. Every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the thunder of armored boots passed my door. They paused for exactly 7 seconds, long enough to check the observation slot, then moved on. It was a ritual as predictable as breathing, the heartbeat of Penitentium Maxima. The guards were not quite human anymore. Their flesh had been replaced with machinery, crude bionics that let them work without rest, without pity. Their eyes were glass and steel, glowing with the cold precision of sensors that could see in absolute darkness. When they spoke, their voices carried the metallic distortion of Voxcaster implants, a chorus of ghosts inside their throats. They took pleasure in our suffering, but it was the pleasure of a machine fulfilling its function, not of a man savoring cruelty. They did not hate us. Hatred would have required recognition. We were not people to them, only inventory, human stock with a tendency to rot. Morning came without sunlight, heralded instead by the sliding of the food slot. They called a meal. What emerged was a gray, viscous paste that smelled faintly of metal and regret. It tasted like nothing and everything at once, a precise balance of recycled proteins and synthetic vitamins designed to keep a body alive just long enough to die on schedule. I ate with my fingers because no utensils were given. I licked the aluminum tray clean because hunger left no room for dignity. Later, I would learn that the paste was more than sustenance. It was control. Within it were mild sedatives to dull aggression, mood stabilizers to quiet despair, and psychoactive traces that softened the will, chemicals that shaped obedience one swallow at a time. In the first weeks, the drugs blurred my thoughts until I felt detached from myself, as though I were watching another man live my life through a sheet of dirty glass. The others around me became shadows, voices in the dark, shapes glimpsed through the narrow cracks between doors. To my left was Marcus. He had been a clerk in the Planetary Defense Force, imprisoned for falsifying requisition records to feed his family during a famine. 6 years he had survived here. His voice never stopped. He talked to fend off madness, telling me stories of his wife and children, people who had probably forgotten him by now. The trick, he would whisper through the thin wall, is to remember who you were. Hold on to something, anything from before. A smell, a song, the color of sunlight through your window. The moment you let go of that, you become what they want you to be. Across the corridor was a woman whose screams haunted every night. In her dreams, worlds burned. Children cried in the fire. She had once been a refugee administrator, charged with corruption for diverting supplies to save lives beyond the Emperor's quotas. Her crime had been compassion. Her punishment was to relive that compassion until it destroyed her mind. Labor began on my 5th day. They woke us before what they called dawn, though no true dawn ever reached this place, and herded us through endless corridors that stretched beyond sight or sense. Penitentium Maxima was not a prison. It was an organism, an industrial beast built to feed on human endurance. Every breath, every drop of sweat, every heartbeat was another unit of production in a machine that never slept. And we, the forgotten, the broken, the discarded, were its fuel. The labor was merciless, a ritual of exhaustion meant to grind away both body and spirit through repetition and futility. My assignment was the Forge Works, a cavern of smoke and molten light where men and women became extensions of machines. There, we built the tools of conquest for wars we would never witness. The heat was constant, unbearable, kept just below the point where human flesh begins to fail. Hot enough to weaken us, but not enough to kill us quickly. The air shimmered with metal dust and chemical vapor, searing the lungs and leaving a taste like copper and ash on the tongue. We worked in teams of 12, our movements synchronized by the rhythm of the production line and the hiss of the overseer's shock prods. Every motion was dictated, every second accounted for. The parts we assembled were small, almost insignificant. Trigger mechanisms for Lost rifles, power couplings for vehicle engines, guidance chips for artillery shells. Yet each had to meet the emperor's standard of perfection. Failure carried punishment, swift, creative, and cruel. A worker whose hands trembled from exhaustion might have those same hands locked into metal braces, forced to labor in positions that tore muscle and tendon. Another who slowed the line's pace could find stimulant injectors jammed into their veins, keeping them awake and functional long after their body began to shut down. The overseers took meticulous notes, recording which methods of suffering increased productivity the most. To them, we were not people, only data points in an experiment on human endurance. I learned to disappear inside myself, to let my body continue its mechanical motions while my mind drifted far away, into some silent place untouched by pain or fear. This detachment was survival, a small rebellion against a system designed to devour the soul. But it came with a cost. Days melted together into an endless present. Time lost meaning. Memory faded like smoke. I forgot the color of grass, the sound of rain, the scent of air that wasn't laced with burning metal. The prison's social structure was as brutal as its labor. Power and desperation shaped every interaction. Alliances formed and shattered daily, ruled by strength and opportunity. The strongest, usually ex-soldiers or hardened criminals, became gang leaders, controlling contraband, ration distribution, and the unspoken economy of fear. They demanded tribute, extra food, labor, protection, or worse. Their punishments were public and immediate, a constant reminder that mercy had no place here. I joined a group led by a former Imperial sergeant named Kane, a man carved from scar tissue and bitterness. He claimed he'd been condemned for cowardice during a chaos cult uprising, though he insisted he'd stayed behind to save civilians. Whether it was truth or delusion didn't matter. What mattered was that Kane understood discipline, and discipline meant survival. Under his protection, I learned the unwritten laws of penitentia maxima. Never show weakness. Weakness was blood in the water, and the predators were always hungry. Never volunteer. Volunteers were the first to die in whatever new horror the guards invented. Never trust completely. Betrayal was a currency more valuable than food. And above all, never surrender hope, because hope, however faint, was the only thing that separated the living from the walking dead. Even the smallest flicker of hope, a memory, a rumor, a whispered promise of release, could keep a man alive one more day. The guards knew this. They encouraged conflict, fed paranoia, and turned prisoner against prisoner. Fighting inmates were easier to manage than united ones. And so, in the choking heat of the forge works, among sparks and screams, we labored. Not as men, not as citizens of the Imperium, but as fuel for the great machine that demanded our suffering. They engineered conflict like artisans of suffering. The guards would create situations where we were forced to compete for scraps of food or the illusion of privilege, then stand back and observe, detached and clinical, as we tore each other apart. To them, we were experiments in survival, laboratory animals, in a grand imperial study on despair. Winners received small rewards, an extra ration, a cleaner cell, a moment of comfort. But victories here were never true. They were temporary flickers of triumph that always came with permanent scars. I killed my first man on what I had decided to call a Tuesday. Time meant nothing in the endless night beneath the earth, but I needed the illusion of days to stay sane. His name was Singh, a former tax collector condemned for skimming from the imperial tithe. He was small, fast, and clever, the sort of man who had built his life on taking from others while convincing them he was doing them a favor. For weeks, Singh had been stealing from my food rations. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to keep me hungry, unfocused, weak. When I finally caught him, he laughed in my face and said I was too soft to stop him. He was wrong. The beating wasn't born of anger. It was surgical. Every strike was deliberate. Every motion practiced from watching how other prisoners settled disputes. I went for joints, nerves, and soft tissue, the places that bruised deep but left little surface evidence. I worked until the movement stopped. When it was done, I felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. The guards found his body during inspection. Natural causes, they wrote. Heart failure from malnutrition and stress. No one questioned it. Questioning meant paperwork, and paperwork meant effort. Singh disappeared from the manifest within hours. Someone else filled his cell before the next meal. That night, King glanced at me across the work line and gave a short nod, something between approval and inevitability. You're learning, he said. The first kill is the hardest. After that, it's just another skill, like welding or reading. You do what you must to survive. He was right. The second death came easier. The third, easier still. By the end of my first year in Penitentia Maxima, I had stopped counting. Violence became routine, another function of existence, as ordinary as sleep or breath. The boundaries of horror stretched wider every day until there was nothing left that could truly shock me. But the real destruction wasn't in the killing. It was slower, quieter, the corrosion of everything that made us human. They fed us just enough to live, never enough to feel full. They gave us rest sufficient to prevent collapse, but never enough to feel alive. They offer medicine that stopped plague, but never pain. The cruelty was scientific. The control, absolute. Their psychological warfare was subtler still. Occasionally, they would announce that certain prisoners were being considered for early release. The news spread like fire. Men fought to prove their worth, to work harder, to obey faster, to smile when spoken to. Some offer information, others offered blood. Every time it was a lie. No one ever left Penitentia Maxima, except as a corpse or a servitor. The servitor program was the final deception. They told volunteers that their minds would live on, purified and repurposed to serve the Imperium, that they would become eternal instruments of his will. But we all knew the truth. The conversion stripped away everything, memory, will, identity, leaving nothing but flesh wired to machinery. And so, even death was denied to us. In Penitentia Maxima, the soul itself was another resource to be harvested, processed, and fed back into the endless machine. The truth behind the servitor program was far more horrific than the propaganda promised. Conversion meant lobotomy followed by cybernetic implantation, a process that stripped away everything human, leaving behind only enough brain function to obey commands and operate machinery. The servitors who maintained Penitentia Maxima had once been men and women like us. Their humanity had been carved out and replaced with mechanical obedience. I watched friends disappear into the conversion chambers, believing they were choosing survival over death. Marcus was one of them, the clerk who had once taught me how to survive, who whispered through the walls that remembering who you were was the only way to stay sane. He volunteered after learning that his wife and children had been killed in a mining collapse on Tertius Prime. The news broke him. To continue living in this place, with no purpose and no future, was more than he could bear. The promise of mechanical peace seemed merciful by comparison. The last time I saw him, he was sweeping the corridor outside my cell. His movements were precise, repetitive, almost graceful in their emptiness. His eyes were gone, replaced by dull optical lenses that glowed faintly in the dark. A lattice of surgical scars marked the back of his skull, where his thoughts and personality had been erased. I called his name. He didn't even turn his head. Marcus was gone. What remained was a machine that wore his face, a hollow vessel that moved through the motions of man who once believed in family and light. Above us, the seasons turned, though we knew them only through subtle changes in air and temperature. Summer brought suffocating heat that made the forge works a furnace of living death. Winter crept through the rock, chilling our blood, making every breath a visible ghost in the air. We endured both with the same numb acceptance. Time became elastic, meaningless. Years passed, or perhaps only months. In the unending twilight of this place, days bled together in a haze of work, pain, and exhausted sleep. I forgot my own age. I can no longer remember if I was 30 or 50 or something in between. My hair turned gray, then white, and began to fall out in brittle clumps from the toxins in the air. My teeth loosened, some fell out, making speech difficult and eating painful. The woman who had once screamed in her sleep, the one haunted by burning worlds, died during my third winter. I heard her death through the wall, a long, rattling exhalation that ended with silence, so heavy it felt like gravity itself. Her body lay untouched for 2 days. The stench of decay spread through the entire cell block, a sour, human rot that clung to our clothes and our skin. When the guards finally came, they dragged her remains down the corridor like a sack of wet cloth. More prisoners arrived to take her place, new faces, wide-eyed and trembling, asking the same questions I once asked about trials, appeals, and mercy. The older inmates just stared back with quiet pity. They knew what I now knew. The only justice in penitentium maxima was survival. I tried to help the newcomers, sharing what I had learned, the unwritten laws that kept you alive a little longer. Some listened. Most did not. They still believed in innocence, in hope, in the idea that this was all a mistake that could somehow be corrected. A few learned fast enough to make it through their first year. Many did not. By my 4th year, the guards grew bored. That was when the gladiatorial combats began, though the official records called them disciplinary exhibitions. The prisoners called them what they truly were, entertainment. Prisoners who broke the rules or failed to meet their production quotas were chosen for disciplinary exhibitions, a cruel euphemism for blood sport. They fought each other in a makeshift arena carved from one of the vast storage chambers. Officially, the fights were not to the death, but the line between injured and dead blurred quickly when medical care was little more than an afterthought. The guards and administrators gathered on raised platforms above us, wagering on outcomes with the detachment of ranchers assessing livestock. They watched our suffering with professional curiosity, discussing our techniques as though we were training specimens, not human beings. My turn came after I struck a guard who was tormenting a dying man in the cell beside mine. The guard had been describing, in grotesque detail, how the prisoner's wife and children had been sold into indentured servitude to settle his unpaid debts. Each word was designed to wound. Each sob from the dying man fed the guard's pleasure. When I told him to stop, his cruelty shifted toward me. He began speculating aloud about what services my body might provide once I became too frail to work the forge lines. The rage that answered him had lived inside me for years, simmering without release. The blow I delivered was pure instinct, fast, final, and utterly beyond thought. My fist crushed his throat. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the air that would not come. He lived, but barely. A mechanical implant replaced his ruined larynx, and his rasping, artificial voice became a constant reminder of what defiance could achieve and what it would cost. For this act of rebellion, I was selected for the arena. My opponent was a mountain of a man named Voss, a former pit fighter who had killed a planetary governor's son during an unsanctioned match. He was young, powerful, and terrifyingly confident, a creature molded by violence and sustained by it. When Voss entered the arena, the spectators erupted in savage cheers that echoed through the concrete chamber. Their excitement had the pitch of hunger. To them, we were beasts unleashed for their amusement. The weapons were crude, lengths of sharpened rebar, weighted chains, jagged bottles wrapped in rags for grip. I chose a length of steel pipe, heavy enough to break bone, light enough to keep my speed. Voss picked up a chain, testing its weight with a fighter's familiarity. The signal came. The fight began. For 17 minutes, though it felt like hours, we circled, struck, bled, and endured. Voss had strength and training. I had desperation, cunning, and years of buried fury. I let him press the attack, using the limited space to force him into predictable movements. His confidence was his weakness. He lunged, overcommitting with a wide, brutal swing. I stepped inside his reach and drove the pipe hard into his solar plexus. The impact collapsed him. His breath came out in wet, choking gasps that painted the ground with blood. Before he could recover, I struck again, a downward blow to the base of his skull. His body convulsed once, then stilled. The chamber exploded with cheers. The guards and administrators clapped and laughed, shouting my name like I was some gladiator born for their stage. But the sound didn't feel like victory. It felt like damnation. In that moment, I understood I had become exactly what they wanted. A killer who fought for their entertainment. A weapon forged not by choice, but by cruelty and circumstance. When they escorted me back to my cell, their faces carried a look of satisfaction, as though I had passed some essential test, proof that their methods of control were working perfectly. The fights that followed were easier on the body, but harder on the soul. Each opponent was a mirror, another prisoner shaped by pain, another soul hollowed by survival. And each time I won, another part of me died. I killed them cleanly, without anger, without hate, because efficiency was what survival demanded. Caring too much would have destroyed me faster than any wound. Compassion was a luxury that Penitentia Maxima had long since burned out of us. Between the fights, I returned to the production lines and tried to remember who I had once been. The memories were slipping away, fading like smoke. They no longer felt like recollections of my own life, but fragments of a story someone else had told me long ago. Had I truly been a teacher once, standing before rows of children who listened with respect and curiosity? Had I really owned a small house with a garden, where I grew vegetables and flowers for no reason other than to witness something beautiful thrive under my care? The details blurred together until I could no longer tell memory from imagination. Perhaps I had never been anyone else. Perhaps I had always been this, a prisoner, a killer, an example crafted to warn others of what happens when one defies the Imperium's will. Maybe my past life was a comforting illusion, a lie my mind invented to make this existence bearable. Cain died in my 5th year, not in combat, but from the slow poison of the air we breathed. The chemicals had eaten through his lungs over months, until his body simply failed. He faced death with the same calm pragmatism that had defined him from the beginning, offering me lessons on leadership and endurance until his voice became too faint to carry through the wall. "Don't let them make you into something you can't live with," he whispered during our final conversation. "I've seen good men become monsters here, and monsters who somehow stayed human. The choice is always yours, even when it feels like you don't have one." When he was gone, a void opened in the prison's hierarchy, and others rushed to fill it. Power changed hands through blood and betrayal, not ballots. Assassination replaced argument. Suspicion replaced loyalty. I stayed out of it. I had learned that visibility was death, that the safest place was in the middle, useful enough to be kept alive, invisible enough not to be feared. The new leader was a woman named Catherine, a former Imperial Navy officer condemned for mutiny after refusing to bombard a civilian colony. She was intelligent, disciplined, and utterly ruthless, a commander who had traded morality for survival. Under her rule, the prisoner organization became sharper, more efficient, but also crueler. Weakness was punished immediately. Mercy was considered treason. She came to me after one of my arena victories, studying me with eyes that had forgotten what pity looked like. "You fight well," she said, "but you fight like a man who still thinks he's leaving this place. That kind of thinking will get you killed." She was right. Though I didn't want to admit it, some small ember of hope still burned inside me, a belief that there might be a way out, or at least a redemption waiting somewhere beyond these walls. That hope made me careless, distracted, slower to adapt. The truly dangerous ones were not the strongest or the smartest, but the ones who had surrendered completely to the truth. They no longer dreamed of freedom. They no longer feared death. Their only thought was the next breath, the next hour, the next small victory in the endless grind of survival. And I was beginning to understand that to live in Penitentia Maxima, I would have to become one of them. The escape attempt came during my 6th year, a desperate, flickering dream of freedom conceived by a group of political prisoners who had managed to bribe several guards and secure crude maps of Penitentia Maxima's labyrinthine corridors. They invited me to join them, recognizing my endurance, my fighting skill, and the simple fact that I was still strong enough to matter. Their plan was intricate, daring, and, in theory, possible. We would stage a diversion during a shift change, overpower the guards at a secondary checkpoint, then use the maintenance tunnels to reach the surface before the alarm could spread through the entire complex. I agreed to participate, though some part of me already knew the truth. The plan was doomed. Not because it lacked logic, but because escape had never been about distance or walls. The real prison was inside us. The corrosion of spirit, the scars on the mind, the quiet surrender that years of captivity carved into the soul. Even if we reached the surface, we would still be carrying ourselves with us. The attempt failed exactly as I expected, though not for the reasons I imagined. The guards had known everything from the beginning. One of our own had betrayed us, a man named Peter, a frail former accountant whose ribs showed through his skin. The promise of better food and lighter duty was all it took to make him trade our lives for another few months of suffering. The overseers let us move forward, watching as we committed ourselves fully. Then, at the precise moment of no return, the alarm screamed through the tunnels, and heavy blast doors sealed us inside like rats in a pipe. The hunt that followed was cold and methodical. There was no rush, no chaos. The guards advanced slowly, using gas to flush us out, shock prods to drop those who resisted, and clubs for the rest. It was extermination performed with military precision. Out of 12 escapees, 4 died on the spot, shot or beaten to death. 3 were selected for servitor conversion, their bodies still twitching as they were dragged toward the laboratories. The remaining 5 were returned to the general population, marked for special monitoring and punishment. I was among those 5, though I no longer knew whether survival was a gift or a curse. Enhanced restrictions meant months of solitary confinement, reduced food rations, and removal from any labor assignment that might provide a path toward another escape. Solitary was a different kind of execution, slower, quieter, and infinitely more complete. My new cell was scarcely larger than a coffin. I could lie down only if I bent my knees. The single strip of light came from a crack beneath the door, too faint to measure time. No voices, no footsteps, only the steady pulse of my own heartbeat and the whisper of my mind unraveling thread by thread. I spoke to myself constantly just to hear sound. I held long conversations with ghosts of my past, students whose names I could no longer recall, friends who might never have existed. I recited poetry I half remembered, told stories to the walls, and hummed melodies whose words had been stripped away by time. After weeks, the line between memory and madness began to dissolve. I answered the voices in my head as if they were sitting beside me. I laughed at jokes no one told. I apologized to people who weren't there. By the 3rd month, the hallucinations arrived, subtle at first. Faces flickered in the darkness, visible only when I wasn't looking directly at them. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, forming human shapes that vanished when I turned my head. I knew they weren't real. Knowledge didn't help. Reality had become elastic, bending to the rhythm of my isolation. In that endless dark, even the unreal felt true. When they finally released me back into the general population, I found that penitentium maxima had changed. Not in the way places naturally change over time, but in the way diseased flesh mutates, uglier, crueler, and more deliberate in its decay. New policies had been enacted, new punishments invented. The guards had grown creative in their pursuit of entertainment. What had once been brutality disguised as discipline was now organized sport. The gladiatorial combats had evolved into a full-scale tournament system, complete with brackets, champions, and betting pools involving personnel across the entire correctional network. The food had worsened. The work assignments had become deadlier. Medical treatment was little more than a cruel joke, a gesture meant to prolong suffering rather than relieve it. Prisoners were dying faster than ever, their bodies collapsing under the double strain of exhaustion and malnutrition. The administration, it seemed, had decided that the most economical way to manage the prison was to grind us all to death as quickly as possible. I had been chosen as one of the featured fighters in the new championship circuit. My reputation from the old arena had grown during my time in isolation. Among the inmates, my name was spoken with a mixture of fear, reverence, and something that resembled pity. They understood, more clearly than I did then, that skill and violence was not a blessing here. It was a curse, one that devoured everything human in those who possessed it. The tournament was structured like a military campaign. Each round eliminated the weak, sending the survivors forward to face stronger, hungrier opponents until only one remained. The prizes were meaningless: extra rations, a cleaner cell, or the empty promise of reduced sentences that no one believed would ever be granted. The real prize was survival, and the real purpose was spectacle. The guards and administrators crowded the upper platforms, shouting wagers and laughing as they watched us destroy each other for their amusement. My first opponent was a young man named David. He couldn't have been more than 20, a draft evader from a planetary defense levy. His face still had softness, untouched by the years of cruelty that shaped the rest of us. He moved like someone who had never truly fought, flailing with desperation rather than intent. I ended it quickly, efficiently, without anger. The pipe struck, his breath caught, and then there was silence. The crowd cheered above me, their voices distant and hollow, like the echo of another world. Something inside me had changed in solitary. Whatever part of me once hesitated at the moment of killing had burned away. Now, there was only calculation, the cold, mechanical precision of action without emotion. The next matches followed the same rhythm: strike, counter, finish. Each opponent fell faster than the last. My movements became leaner, sharper, stripped of anything unnecessary. I no longer fought for victory. I fought because the system required it. The tournament's final round came faster than expected. My last opponent was Catherine, the former naval officer who had inherited Kane's mantle as the prisoner's leader. She was older than me, hardened by command, and utterly without illusion. Her strength came from the acceptance of her fate. She had stopped hoping long ago. As we prepared to fight, she looked at me with a steady, almost weary calm. "One of us walks away," she said quietly. "The other becomes fertilizer for whatever weeds grow in the prison graveyard." Her words carried no threat, only truth. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure which outcome I preferred. "But either way," Catherine said, her voice calm and steady, "we're both already dead. We died the day we walked through those doors. Everything since then has just been the body learning to catch up." She was right, and the truth of her words stripped away the final remnants of conscience and humanity that still clung to me. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Not the freedom of escape, but the freedom that comes from understanding there's nothing left to lose. I fought her with everything I had learned in Penitentia Maxima. Every brutal lesson, every instinct sharpened by fear and hunger, every deception that had kept me alive when better souls had perished. We circled each other like predators, too experienced to make careless mistakes, too stubborn to die easily. The fight stretched on longer than any other. Each strike was calculated, each feint met with equal cunning. Blood mixed with sweat, the floor slicked beneath our feet. When I finally killed her, it was not through skill or strength, but through deceit. I feigned a wound, a stagger, a gasp, and she hesitated just for a heartbeat. It was enough. My weapon struck her temple with a sound like a stone shattering glass. The bone gave way, fragments piercing her brain. She fell wordlessly. There was no accusation in her eyes, no surprise. Only the weary expression of someone who had known, all along, that this would be her end. The crowd roared above us, guards, administrators, functionaries of the Imperium, their cheers echoing through the chamber like the screams of the damned. They celebrated my victory as though it meant something. It did not. I stood over Catherine's body, covered in her blood and my own, and felt nothing. The tournament was finished. I was their champion now, their proof of what unrestrained cruelty could produce. My reward was the same as it had always been: another cell, another day, another lie. That night, they returned me to my quarters with promises of better food, cleaner air, and improved conditions. I didn't bother listening. The tournament had achieved its purpose. It had entertained them, and it had reminded every prisoner that skill of violence was not a path to freedom, but a spiral toward extinction. I kept fighting when summoned. I kept killing whoever they placed before me until age or damage would eventually end my usefulness, and they would quietly dispose of me as they had so many before. The years that followed dissolved into monotony, a gray continuum of violence, labor, and exhaustion. I fought in the arena when ordered, worked the forges when assigned, and existed in my cell between those obligations. The other inmates avoided me now. They saw what I had become, something less than human, something dangerous and hollow. New prisoners kept arriving, filling the void left by those who had died, been converted, or simply vanished into the machinery of the institution. I watched them endure the same cycle of fear, defiance, and resignation, but I no longer felt any urge to help. Their fates meant nothing to me. Survival itself had become meaningless. When sleep came, it brought no solace. My dreams were not of freedom or revenge or redemption. They were dreams of absence, of dissolving into the walls, of merging with the cold stone and rusted steel, of forgetting my name, my face, my history. I dreamed of peace, the kind that comes only when consciousness fades and the burden of being ends. But consciousness refused to die. It dragged me through each day, through each ritual of suffering, through each mechanical breath. My body endured, scarred and fragile, kept alive by inertia. My mind continued to record the monotony, one identical day bleeding into the next. I no longer measured time in days or years. I measured it in deaths. The deaths became my measure of time. The deaths of opponents in the arena. The deaths of cellmates from disease, starvation, or simple exhaustion. And the quieter deaths, the ones inside me, as pieces of my humanity withered away, one after another. Each death was a tally mark on an invisible calendar, tracing my slow transformation from human being into something else, something that still wore a human face, but no longer remembered what being human meant. Occasionally, the administrators visited my cell. They studied me with the detached fascination of scholars examining a successful experiment. Their questions were precise, methodical. My observations on prison conditions, my emotional state, my suggestions for increasing the efficiency of the correctional process. I answered honestly. It was easier than lying. In penitentia maxima, truth and deception had become meaningless distinctions, two sides of the same rusted coin, neither of which could buy freedom. "You've adapted remarkably well," one administrator remarked during a long interview. "Most prisoners either break completely or remain defiant enough to cause complications. You found the ideal balance between compliance and functionality." I asked him what that meant, though I already knew. "It means," he said with satisfaction, "you've become exactly what the system was designed to create, a human stripped of every instinct for resistance, yet still intelligent enough to serve a purpose. You are the model for the future of imperial corrections." He was proud of the precision with which they had dismantled me and rebuilt what remained. Proud of the thing I had become. I was their masterpiece, proof that any soul could be re-engineered, that the human will itself could be processed and repurposed. The man I had once been was gone, dissolved into routine and obedience. What remained was an echo, a creature that looked like him but carried none of his essence. That night, lying on my metal sleeping platform, I tried to remember my own face. The image that surfaced was featureless, blurred, perhaps imaginary. I cannot recall the color of my eyes or the shape of my mouth when I smiled. Whoever that person had been, he was a stranger to me now, distant, irrelevant, extinct. The final revelation came during what I think was my 10th year in penitentia maxima, though time had long since ceased to matter. A new administrator arrived, young, idealistic, with a kind of optimism that suggested she had not yet learned the futility of compassion in this place. She introduced reforms, better food, improved medical care, and educational programs meant to prepare inmates for eventual reintegration. The changes were small, but undeniable. For the first time in years, something stirred within me, something faint, almost forgotten, a memory of what hope once felt like. Perhaps redemption, I thought, was not entirely beyond reach. Perhaps even in the darkest corner of the Imperium, a man could still remember how to be human. Perhaps the person I had once been was not entirely dead, only buried, dormant somewhere in the depths of my mind, waiting for the right conditions to reawaken. Somewhere, I told myself, a fragment of that man still remembered what it meant to be human. The new administrator's name was Elena Vasquez. She arrived with energy and purpose, her voice carrying a kind of conviction that was rare within the walls of Penitentia Maxima. Her first initiative was to conduct personal interviews with long-term inmates, assessing what she called their rehabilitation potential. When my turn came, I found myself sitting across from her in a small office unlike anything I'd seen in years. Someone had filled it with touches of life, potted plants, framed photographs, and hollow images of worlds where sunlight still touched green, living things. The simplicity of it was disorienting. I could not concentrate on her questions because my eyes kept drifting toward a picture of children running through a park. The image felt like a memory of another existence, one that no longer belonged to me. "You've been here longer than almost anyone," Vasquez said, scanning the thick file before her. 10 years, 4 months, and 17 days. That's an unusual length of service for someone with your original classification. Service. The word caught me off guard. She said it as though my imprisonment were employment, as if all of this, the work, the violence, the years of degradation, had been a contribution to some greater purpose. I couldn't tell whether she truly believed that or if she simply needed to. Then she asked, "What would you like to do if you were released?" Her tone was sincere, and sincerity was dangerous here. Hope was a weakness that could kill you faster than hunger or despair. I chose my words carefully. "I don't know," I said. "I don't remember wanting anything, not for a long time." It was the truth. My only ambitions now were food, warmth, and the absence of pain. The dreams that had once guided me, teaching, family, meaning, felt like artifacts from another species. Vasquez made a note in her file, her brow creasing slightly. "The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable," she said, "but it's not irreversible. With structure and gradual reintegration, even deep trauma can be healed." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that some transformations reached a point of no return. The man she was speaking to no longer existed except as memory, a skeleton of reflexes held together by habit and endurance. But I said nothing. Hope was precious to her, and shattering it would serve no purpose. Her reforms began soon after. Modest improvements to food and medical care, and, most ambitious of all, the creation of educational programs taught by prisoners who still remembered what it meant to think. I joined the literacy and arithmetic classes, not because I needed the lessons, but because structure gave shape to time. The instructor for my literacy class was Samuel, a former librarian with the gentle patience of someone who still believed words mattered. His crime had been curiosity, possession of forbidden texts deemed subversive to imperial order. He taught us with quiet dignity, his hands trembling slightly as he guided us through letters and sentences. "Reading," he told us one day, his voice a faint whisper, "is remembering how to be human. Every word you understand is a piece of yourself the system hasn't destroyed yet." 3 weeks later, Samuel was dead, struck in the head with a metal tray by another inmate over an extra food ration. His death was registered as disciplinary incident, resolved. But for those of us who had sat in his class, something vital died with him. The educational program continued under new instructors, but they lacked Samuel's quiet conviction. They taught words as mechanics, not meaning. Reading became just another form of labor, efficient, hollow, stripped of the soul that had once made it an act of defiance. Administrator Vasquez lasted 8 months before being reassigned. The official statement cited budgetary restructuring and efficiency requirements. In truth, I think she simply cared too much for a place that had forgotten what caring was. Her departure left behind another absence, small, almost invisible, but I felt it. For a brief moment, under her reforms, I had almost remembered what hope felt like. And when she was gone, I understood that the man I used to be had stirred in his grave, only to die a second time. Everyone understood the unspoken truth. Compassion was expensive, and the Imperium had no appetite for wasting resources on the rehabilitation of people who would never again be useful citizens. Elena Vasquez's reforms lasted only as long as her presence. Her replacement was Colonel Marcus Thorne, a hard, efficient man whose reputation had been forged in prisoner of war camps during the Third Tarsus campaign. He arrived with a clear mandate: cut operational costs while maintaining, even increasing, productivity. His methods reflected the outlook of a career soldier who treated inmates as enemy combatants, not citizens who had erred. Within days, the modest gains from Vasquez's tenure were erased. Food rations reverted to bare subsistence. Medical care became strictly emergency triage. Educational programs were swept away and replaced by longer, harsher work shifts. The gladiatorial tournaments returned with a vengeance. They were more frequent, more elaborate, and structured to maximize participation and spectacle. Betting pools swelled. Prize tiers multiplied. The message was explicit: entertainment, productivity, deterrence. Rehabilitation is a luxury we cannot afford, Thorne announced during his first address to the compound. Your function here is to serve the Imperium through labor until your sentence is complete or your usefulness expires. Those who accept that will live more tolerably than those who cling to unrealistic expectations. The rollback was brutal and swift, yet the brief breathing space created under Vasquez had left something behind that could not be wholly erased. A few prisoners had tasted being treated like humans rather than resources. That memory turned into a subtle and dangerous ember. Quiet networks formed, shared goods, whispered information, the beginning threads of coordinated action. The idea of collective purpose, once planted, proved harder to bury than any corporal body. I received several approaches. Groups sought me out for different reasons. Some wanted escape, others plotted sabotage or symbolic acts of protest. My reputation as an arena fighter made me a desirable asset for violent plans. My decade of service gave me knowledge of routines, guard rotations, and weak points useful for less overt resistance. I refused. I understood the calculus. Organized rebellion would hand the administration its pretext for a merciless purge. Better to be invisible than heroic. Better to survive than die for a cause that would only tighten the screws on everyone left behind. 3 months after Thorne's arrival, the crackdown came. A smuggling network was uncovered. Contraband moved between blocks, small favors traded for food or protection. The investigation that followed was surgical and cruel. Interrogations, strip searches, roll calls that lasted for hours. Punishments designed to extract information and to deter others. The administration used promises of leniency and threats of brutality to turn prisoners against one another, shredding trust until cooperation became impossible. They questioned me repeatedly. They wanted names, connections, proof of intent. The interrogators were specialists who understood the psychology of long-term captivity. They knew which pressures would fracture solidarity and which would bend the most stubborn minds. You're a survivor, the lead interrogator told me in our final session. You've lasted 10 years by adapting, by avoiding unnecessary risk. Helping us would follow that pattern of intelligent self-preservation. It was the oldest offer in the book, collaboration in exchange for small comforts. The choice was framed as practical, cooperation versus continued resistance. But both roads led to the same end. Collaborators were useful until they were not, then quietly erased. Resistors were disposed of sooner and with less ceremony. Either way, the system retained its ultimate prerogative: to convert human beings into units of utility and to discard them when their value diminished. The choice they offered was never a real choice at all, only a small variation on disciplined submission. I chose a third option: complete withdrawal from anything that could be interpreted as cooperation or resistance. I attended no meetings, joined no conversations that might hint at planning, and avoided every association that could draw suspicion. I worked when ordered, fought when summoned, and during every other hour, I simply existed, silent, motionless like a machine powered down between operating cycles. This strategy of deliberate invisibility worked. It kept me beneath notice, beyond interrogation, and outside the attention of both prisoners and guards. But the cost was absolute isolation. Whatever remained of community inside Penitentia Maxima dissolved around me. The other inmates avoided me, uncertain whether I had become an informant or merely gone mad. In time, I became a ghost, present but unseen, alive but no longer truly living. The resistance network did not survive much longer. It was destroyed through a mixture of betrayal and meticulous investigation. Informants traded names for rations and lighter shifts. Within weeks, its members were executed, converted, or sent to facilities far worse than ours. The administration declared victory, celebrating with new restrictions on movement and communication. Surveillance expanded to every corridor and cell. Unauthorized contact became nearly impossible. Once the purge was complete, Colonel Marcus Thorne summoned me to his office. He studied me across the desk, his eyes sharp, assessing like a man inspecting a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. 43 prisoners were involved in resistance activities, he said, glancing down at a report. 43 individuals who risked everything for the illusion of freedom or dignity or whatever abstract notion they believed worth dying for. You were not among them, despite having the skills, connections, and record that would make you a valuable addition. He paused, expecting me to explain my absence. I said nothing. Anything I told him could only create new problems. Thorne leaned back, considering. Intelligence suggests you're either the smartest inmate in this facility, he said at last, or the most broken. Either way, you represent a useful data point for understanding long-term adaptation to confinement. You'll be transferred to the research wing for extended observation and testing. The research wing lay deep beneath the main complex, accessible only through multiple checkpoints that required layered authorization codes. The prisoners housed there were test subjects, tools for the study of control, punishment, and rehabilitation efficiency. Some had volunteered, seduced by promises of comfort and leniency. Others, like me, had simply been chosen for qualities that fit the experiment's needs. My new cell was an improvement, larger, cleaner, with adjustable lighting and temperature controls. A small reinforced window overlooked the dim caverns where the prison's power systems and waste processors rumbled endlessly. But these comforts were not kindness. They were practical, environmental control designed to keep research subjects stable and alive over long periods of study. The testing began immediately. Teams of specialists arrived daily, armed with scanners, restraints, and data slates. They measured everything: reaction time, cognitive endurance, stress response, and pain tolerance. Electrodes recorded my heartbeat. Cameras captured every motion, every tremor, every flinch. I had escaped suspicion, but not captivity. My invisibility had bought me survival, only to make me valuable again, this time as an object of study. They were charting the effects that 10 years of imprisonment had carved into my mind and body, documenting, with clinical precision, the slow metamorphosis from functioning citizen to institutional artifact. The physical examinations exposed what a decade inside Penitentia Maxima had done to me. My lungs were scarred by years of inhaling chemical-laden air. My bones had thinned, stripped of density by poor nutrition. My nervous system showed the constant tension of hypervigilance, the same neural pattern seen in soldiers who had survived too many battles. I had become a catalog of institutional damage, a living exhibit of what prolonged confinement could sculpt from human flesh and will. The psychological evaluations were more intricate. They conducted tests to measure empathy, social instinct, moral reasoning, and emotional response. The researchers seemed particularly fascinated by my ability to kill without hesitation, to extinguish life without apparent anger or regret. They constructed elaborate scenarios, simulations that forced me to choose between self-preservation and compassion, and then recorded every hesitation, every flicker of reasoning that followed. Fascinating, one of them murmured, eyes flicking across a data slate. A complete erosion of conventional moral inhibition, but not psychopathy. No, antisocial pathology. The subject's ethical framework has simply restructured itself around survival imperatives. Function over morality. To them, I was no longer a man. I was a successful experiment, living proof that a human being could be stripped down, redesigned, and rebuilt according to institutional need. I had become evidence that their system worked, that with enough time and precision, the mind could be remade as reliably as metal. The others in the research wing represented various stages of that transformation. Some were new arrivals who still resisted the conditioning, clinging to fragments of who they had been. Others had progressed further, their obedience mechanical, their responses automatic. And a few had surpassed even my level of adaptation, reduced to biological machines that reacted to stimuli without trace of thought or emotion. The lead researcher assigned to my case was Dr. Helena Cross, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that never seemed to blink. Her focus was absolute, her dedication unsettling. She spoke to me often during the evaluation sessions, as though I were both subject and confidant. The traditional correctional model relies on punishment and deprivation, she explained once, reviewing the notes from my latest tests. But punishment is inefficient. It requires constant supervision, discipline, enforcement. What we're building here is more elegant. She looked up, her expression almost reverent. We're designing subjects who internalize institutional order so completely that external control becomes unnecessary. A perfect alignment between identity and authority. She was describing the creation of perfect prisoners, beings who would no longer need guards, because obedience had become their nature. The results of her work, she told me, would soon be replicated throughout the Imperium, an empire of silent, compliant inmates who would police themselves and one another according to administrative will. And as she spoke, I realized that in their eyes, I was not the last remnant of humanity left in this place. I was its prototype. You represent our most successful case study, Dr. Cross said calmly. 10 years of systematic conditioning have produced an individual who functions optimally within institutional parameters while retaining enough cognitive ability to perform complex tasks. You're the model, the template for the future of imperial justice. Her words might have been praise, but they felt like a sentence. I asked her what would happen once the research concluded, when my usefulness as a test subject finally ran its course. That depends on the results of your final evaluations, she replied, without hesitation. Subjects who demonstrate stable adaptation may be transferred to labor programs where their abilities can be utilized. Others may be selected for advanced modification to further enhance their institutional value. Advanced modification. I knew what that meant. Servitor conversion, the surgical removal of thought and will, leaving behind only obedience wrapped in flesh and circuitry. It was not a future, but a postscript. I was being offered a choice between two deaths, one slow and conscious, the other efficient and absolute. The research continued for months. Each day brought new trials, new experiments designed to chart the edges of what I had become. They tested moral reasoning, empathy, memory, and instinct, dissecting my psyche with the precision of cartographers mapping an unknown world. Every impulse, every reaction was measured, categorized, and archived for future application. The final phase of testing involved experimental conditioning, procedures designed to perfect what a decade of imprisonment had begun. They administered chemical treatments to alter my neurotransmitters, surgeries that targeted select regions of the brain, and behavioral therapies built on cycles of reward and punishment. I submitted to everything. Resistance was pointless, and in truth, I lacked the will to pretend otherwise. They mistook my compliance for cooperation, recording it in their notes as evidence of stable adaptation. What they failed to recognize was that surrender can become so complete, it looks indistinguishable from obedience. The treatments produced results. My cognitive patterns stabilized. Emotional responses flattened. The neural data confirmed reduced variability and increased conformity to institutional expectations. I was becoming a more perfect version of what they had always intended to create, a human framework tuned precisely to the rhythm of control. Dr. Cross seemed pleased. She spoke with the measured satisfaction of a scientist admiring her own work, never acknowledging that her subjects still understood every word. During our final interview, she reviewed the files that contained my life, page by page, her tone almost reverent. "The techniques we've developed here will transform correctional practice across the Imperium," she said. "No more wasting resources on containment. Instead of letting criminals rot in cells, we'll produce loyal servants, individuals who contribute productively to Imperial society." She looked up from her notes. "Do you have any questions about the research or your role in it?" It was a curious question, asking the object of destruction to comment on its dismantling. I considered it carefully before replying. "Yes," I said. "Do you think the person who entered Penitentium Maxima 10 years ago would recognize what I've become?" Dr. Cross paused, her expression unreadable. "Probably not," she said at last. "But that person was a criminal, one who endangered Imperial stability through seditious behavior. The transformation was necessary." And with that, she closed the file and the last remnants of my identity with it. "The individual sitting before me," Dr. Cross said, "is now a loyal subject who understands his proper role within the Imperial Order. By any reasonable measure, the transformation represents an improvement." From her perspective, she was right. The man who had once spoken out against corruption had been erased, replaced by something useful, compliant, and silent. The process had been efficient, thorough, and absolute in its success. I was living proof of the system's effectiveness, a monument to the power of Imperial correction. Rehabilitation, as defined by their doctrine, meant the total eradication of undesirable traits. By that standard, I was the perfect result. 3 days later, the notification of my transfer arrived. The guards who delivered it treated me with the careful respect reserved for valuable machinery being moved between departments. I was to be reassigned to an agri-world, Demeat's Garden, where my conditioning and skills would serve the Empire's food production networks. The transport ship carried others like me, graduates of correctional research programs, each molded into different forms of obedience. Some moved with mechanical precision, others stared blankly ahead, their eyes devoid of recognition. We sat in silence for the duration of the journey, each trapped within whatever faint consciousness remained, incapable of the kind of thought or speech that might once have offered comfort. The name Demeat's Garden promised lushness, but the world itself was barren. Its surface was a patchwork of overworked soil and industrial ruin, stripped of life and color. The air carried the acrid tang of chemicals, and the ground reeked of decay. Every breath was filtered dust. Every horizon was gray. It was a world that survived only through relentless intervention, a machine pretending to be a planet. Work camps dotted the landscape, each dedicated to a different branch of agricultural production: grain cultivation, protein synthesis, or nutrient extraction from organic waste. The workers were a blend of indentured laborers, penal colonists, and modified research subjects like myself. All had been shaped to maximize efficiency and minimize the need for supervision. I was assigned to Camp 17, responsible for cultivating protein-rich algae across vast artificial lakes that shimmered dull green beneath a polluted sky. The task was endless: maintaining filtration systems, adjusting nutrient levels, ensuring optimal growth rates, a cycle of labor that repeated with flawless monotony. The others rarely spoke. Most could not. Whatever remained of their individuality had been chemically or surgically muted. Our work schedules, sleep cycles, and caloric intake were regulated through neural implants that pulsed with silent authority. We functioned like clockwork, our bodies synchronized to the same mechanical rhythm. The administrators were few, their presence unnecessary in a camp where obedience had been engineered. Days folded into months. Months bled into years. I maintained the systems, harvested the algae, processed the nutrient sludge, and began again. It was a closed loop: work as existence, existence as work, sustained by repetition and devoid of meaning. And yet, in the narrow moments between sleep and waking, fragments of something else would surface. Faint, fragile images from a life that no longer belonged to me. Sunlight spilling across wooden floors, the laughter of children somewhere far away, the taste of food made with care rather than efficiency. They flickered like ghosts, reminders of a humanity that had not survived the process, yet somehow refused to be completely forgotten. The memories came like messages from a ghost, faint transmissions from someone who had died so long ago that even his name was lost. There were whispers from a life I could barely remember, flashes of sunlight and laughter that belonged to a stranger. But the dreams always faded, erased by the brutal light of morning and the demands of another day's labor. The man who had once lived those moments of warmth and connection was as distant from me now as the emperor himself, a figure acknowledged, but no longer truly understood. The years blurred together, marked only by the slow decay of my body and the gradual failure of the machines I tended. My hair turned completely white. My hands shook from decades of exposure to industrial toxins. My eyes grew dim, the precision of my work eroding with every cycle. I was becoming obsolete, a piece of biological machinery wearing out, soon to be replaced. The end did not come with ceremony or violence, but with the quiet precision of bureaucracy. A medical evaluation concluded that my productivity had fallen below acceptable levels. The cost of maintaining my health now exceeded the worth of my labor. The decision was made. Termination, efficient and painless, the most economical resolution to a diminishing asset. I was given 3 days to complete my final assignments, to ensure that the transition to my replacement would proceed without loss of output. For those 3 days, I worked as I always had, cleaning filters, checking gauges, calibrating machinery, as if the shadow of my approaching death had no weight at all. Only the faint awareness of a ticking countdown separated those days from every other in the long monotony of my service. On the final day, they escorted me to the processing facility. The chamber was clean and silent, its air tinged with antiseptic. Rows of workers waited in ordered lines, seated like discarded tools awaiting disassembly. Each of us bore an identification tag and a processing code to ensure proper record-keeping after disposal. The only sounds were the low hum of the machines and the occasional shuffle of feet as another name was called. When my number was announced, I rose and walked forward without hesitation. There was nothing left to fear. The technician who awaited me worked with the calm precision of routine. She checked my identification, confirmed the authorization, and prepared the injection that would stop my heart. Her tone was professional, detached. "Any final statement for the record?" she asked, more out of habit than curiosity. I met her gaze and replied, "I've been dead for 11 years, 7 months, and 22 days. I'm just grateful my body's finally catching up." She nodded once, made a note in her ledger, and administered the injection. The chemicals entered my bloodstream with the same efficiency that had governed every aspect of imperial procedure. My vision dimmed. My breathing slowed. The world grew quiet. In those final moments, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: peace. The constant vigilance, the endless calculations for survival, all faded into stillness. The weight of obedience slipped from my shoulders. And as my mind flickered toward darkness, I realized that for the first time in over a decade, I was finally free. The final thought that drifted through my fading mind was not regret, or anger, or fear, only a simple realization. The Imperium had succeeded with flawless precision. The man who had once believed in justice, who had dared to speak against corruption, was gone. In his place remained something efficient, compliant, and entirely expendable. A being that had served imperial interests until the moment its usefulness expired. The system had functioned exactly as intended. It had transformed a problem into a resource, then discarded that resource when it no longer offered value. My death was entered into the facility's records as routine maintenance, no more significant than the replacement of a damaged filter or the disposal of contaminated waste. The body that had carried 11 years of endurance and decay was fed into the organic recycling units, its remnants broken down into nutrient compounds. Those compounds, in turn, nourished the algae farms where other conditioned workers would continue the endless cycle of labor, production, and consumption. In the 41st millennium, prison is not punishment. It is transformation. It is not correct. It consumes. It takes human beings and grinds them down into something more efficient, more obedient, and infinitely less troublesome. Everything that once gave meaning to life is stripped away until only function remains. The process is perfect, efficient, cost-effective, and utterly successful in achieving its goal. There is no redemption, because redemption implies a return, and the changes inflicted upon prisoners are irreversible by design. There is no justice, because justice demands a measure of morality, and the Imperium recognizes only what is productive or counterproductive. There is no hope, for hope depends on the possibility of change. And here, the only change is the slow decay that leads from servitude to death. The guards, the administrators, the researchers, they are not monsters. They are functionaries, enacting a system that has perfected the conversion of human problems into human resources. Their evil is not emotional, but procedural, the cold, logical fulfillment of imperial necessity. In the end, those who enter imperial prisons leave behind everything that once made them human, except for the bare biological machinery that can still serve the Emperor's will. Their minds are stripped of independence, their bodies reshaped for maximum efficiency, and their spirits crushed so completely that the very idea of resistance becomes unthinkable. They are the perfect prisoners, compliant, predictable, and infinitely disposable. This is the truth of justice in the Imperium of Man, a machine that long ago abandoned the illusion of rehabilitation in favor of pure resource extraction. Within its walls, prisoners are not citizens to be corrected, but raw material to be processed. Their fate is determined not by guilt or innocence, but by the ever-shifting demands of institutional efficiency. The man I had once been would never recognize what I became. Perhaps that, in its own way, is mercy. For when the memory of humanity is erased, so too is the pain of knowing it was lost. The perfect prisoner feels no grief for what has been taken, because he no longer remembers that it was ever his. In the end, imperial justice achieves its purpose with flawless precision. The elimination of threats to social order through the conversion of those threats into obedient tools. The process is brutal yet thorough, cruel yet cost-effective, efficient yet absolute. It serves the Imperium perfectly, while erasing everything that might once have questioned its morality. This is what prison means in the 41st millennium. It is not a place of punishment or redemption, but a factory, a vast, grinding engine that takes broken people and breaks them further until they become exactly what the system requires. And when even their brokenness ceases to be useful, they are discarded with the same efficiency that defined their transformation. There is no escape because the system does not merely imprison the body, it rebuilds the mind. There is no rebellion because rebellion requires a self, and the self is the first thing the process destroys. There is no hope because hope depends on the possibility of change, and change is the one thing the Imperium does not allow. Only one truth remains at the end, the truth I carried into death. That death, when it comes, is not defeat but completion. The system achieves its perfect victory not in killing its prisoners, but in remaking them so completely that killing becomes redundant. My death was nothing more than procedure, the disposal of waste that had already fulfilled its purpose.